And welcome back to Library Boxes of Trenton podcast. Coming to you from Classics, Books, and Gifts, the third Saturday of each month from 1 to 3 p.m. I sit down with authors like who I have here today, Tanya Hernandez. And Tanya, this is her third book, Multiracials and Civil Rights, Mixed Race Stories of Discrimination. And just moments ago, we chatted about a case that that is in the book about a young woman who works in retail who had some discrimination once the management found out that she was not just mixed race, but particularly black, mixed African American, etc. We've talked before about within the black and the Latino and Hispanic communities how there's a different, almost like a caste system, for lack of a better term, where it's dark skin, light skin, good hair, bad hair, etc. Talk about that a little bit from your perspective, and then let's talk about that, how it transcends into the book.
Well, it's interesting to me the way in which the conversation about racial mixture is somewhat new in the United States, because it's not a new conversation for the rest of the Americas. Right? So in Latin America and the Caribbean, there's long been what we call a mestizaje, this idea that racial mixture should be celebrated, and it makes us more evolved and more racially progressive than the rest of the world because we view ourselves as embodying the rainbow.
And just so that I want to stop you there because I want to make sure that people understand that when we talk about the Caribbeans and the Americas, a lot of times people think or recognize the Native American or the indigenous population, the Indian population in the Caribbean, but also through the slave trade, the Africans coming there as well, and then the intermixing.
Exactly. And the interesting thing here is that, my family's from Puerto Rico, and there's a real celebration of racial mixture with a real focus, though, on the Taino Indian. Although historians, many of them say that, by the 1500s, the Taino Indians were pretty much exterminated, right? Through disease and genocide, etc., by the Spaniards. And the real mixture that, is present on the island is European with African. Okay. That's also part of the pathology of how race is understood and discussed in Puerto Rico, the Caribbean, and Latin America. There's this lip service paid to elevating celebrations of racial mixture, while at the same time there's a sort of an anti-blackness deeply embedded in there. And so that has been my life experience, that I'd hear in Spanish, oh, how wonderful we all are. We're much better than the Americans, meaning North Americans, meaning U.S. people, because we're more racially evolved with this celebration of racial mixture. At the same time that I was hearing a lot of anti-black language about dark-skinned people in Latino communities, but also African Americans as well. Right? And so I always had a really complicated understanding of this notion of what it means to be racially mixed. That it doesn't come necessarily with a guarantee that means you are racial justice minded, or that you don't carry anti-black bias and prejudice. And so that's also part of the driving force behind the book, and wanting to look close up at mixed race stories of discrimination in the United States, to see were they having something different go on there, or were they too sort of experiencing this sort of confrontation with lip service of celebrating racial mixture, while at the same time something really negative is going on that is very embedded in non-white discrimination. Sometimes it's not always anti-black, right? Meaning I've got stories in the book about women who are Filipina and racially mixed, and what they experience is sort of a very familiar non-white white discrimination. And in what I see in both employment, housing discrimination, public accommodations, people going to restaurants, people going into clubs and being rejected. Also in the criminal justice system, all these spaces, education, I look at all of them, and what I see is a sort of time after time after time, people who are racially mixed identified, right, that they have a fluid racial identity, but when they experience racial discrimination, it's very crude. It's very non-white versus white.
Now, being an educator at Fordham University, what do you feel your students their understanding of multiracials and civil rights and biases and discriminations, do you feel that they're getting it, do they have an understanding of it, or is it because they're in college and their minds are more open to this?
Well, there's a range, of course. I have, for a number of students, the idea that there is a growth in the number of people who now have more fluid racial identities, who think of themselves as not in any single category. They equate that with an automatic sort of diminishment of racism in the United States. So do they think that one thing comes with the other?
And just to elaborate on that, so you're thinking that that they may feel as though racism, the way older people experienced it, just doesn't exist anymore?
Oh, they think that there's something now, that our racial progress is measured by the increase in the number of people who not only have intimacy across racial categories, but also people who now identify with that racial mixture. They think that itself means that we have less discrimination, that there's less racism.
Gotcha. Because more people are coming together from different backgrounds and getting married and having children, so that means that we as a society are evolving.
Exactly. Right? And so for them, it is somewhat disheartening, right, to hear from me that when I do this research, what I discover is that, well, yes, you can have a growth in people who sort of are coming together across racial categories, sometimes marrying, sometimes not marrying, but having intimacy and having children who now identify in more complex and nuanced ways. But that doesn't mean that in of itself decreases discrimination, right? Meaning that the work of discrimination is work of anti-discrimination and racial justice. That's work, and that doesn't come just because you now have more intimacy across race lines.
Yeah.
We've long had intimacy across race lines in Latin America and many other places, and that did not magically erase inequality. Inequality only gets erased with intentional actions and a dedication and investment in doing it.
Now, in your book, Multiracials and Civil Rights, which is available through all the traditional outlets, Barnes & Noble, Amazon.com, and if you go to NYU University, you can get a discount if you use code
PC. Oh goodness, 20.
PC, that's right.
Oh,
PC,
I have it on a postcard somewhere.
It's definitely PC 20 if you go to NYU Press. So, in your book, do you put forth any ideas of how we can move forward, how we can progress as a society?
Well, yes. What my sort of takeaway, right, from doing all the research is that when the claimants, people who are bringing their discrimination cases, were very focused on explaining to the judge how their experience of discrimination while being a mixed race person might sound different, that what they were actually experiencing is very much part of the same old social dynamic that we've long had in our society of group-based inequality, right? Meaning being targeted not because of who you are as an individual, but being targeted because of a perception about what social group you come from or are affiliated with in some way, whatever the fraction may be presumed to be, that is the engine of discrimination, and then that's what needs to be focused on. So I call this sort of like a socio-political understanding of discrimination, as opposed to a very individualistic, dignity-based way of thinking about discrimination.
Okay. Now, finally, for the young people, the young adults who are taking your class, do you feel or see that there's a progressive movement among them, like they become invigorated about how they can change this dynamic?
Definitely. I have to say that it's really emotional for me to be an educator, because I find that my students, they feed me and they re-energize me with their passion and desire to change the world. And so meaning if I was doing all this same research, but just alone in a library, and thinking my thoughts all by myself, I think I could get very easily defeated. But it's being out there with my students, trying to share what I know, and then they reflecting back to me what they find valuable. that I have to say is a really important part of my life, and I view it very much as a vocation that then helps me write what I can write.
That's fantastic. Tanya Hernandez is the author, Multiracials and Civil Rights. More information will be up on the Trenton